Good evening, everybody. My name's Colin Forrest. I'm one of the members of the Council of the Queensland branch of AIIA, or Queensland chapter. I'd like to begin tonight firstly by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we're meeting, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and honour their elders past, present and future. I also want to welcome here tonight, before I welcome our guest speaker, I want to welcome, I presume I call you Your Excellency or His Excellency, but I shall, His Excellency Yang Cheng-Kui, the Deputy Consul General, who represents here the Consulate General of the People's Republic of China in Brisbane. Welcome. This is His Excellency's first attendance at one of our events, and we want to convey our most sincere welcome to you and hope you come along to more in the future.
Thank you.
Tonight we have the absolute privilege of having as our guest speaker Associate Professor Andrew Phillips. Now, Andrew's only an associate professor for another month or so. He's actually been recently promoted to professor, but I'm told he's not officially able to use that title until the 1st of January. He's been told by the University of Queensland. So, associate, but soon to be Professor Andrew Phillips. Now, I'm privileged and honoured to welcome Andrew and introduce him tonight. I have just completed my own Masters of International Relations at the University of Queensland, which I did over the last 6 years. 2 out of my 12 subjects, I had the pleasure of having Andrew as my teacher, my lecturer. So one of those was international security, which was one of the mandatory 4 subjects of the degree. And just recently, my last subject, which I finished, which was a great way to finish the course, was the subject of strategic studies. And I know Andrew is devoted to that subject and a terrific teacher of it, and taught it with absolute enthusiasm and, might I say, a great sense of humour brought to the subject as well. And what I did notice with the subjects that I did with Andrew is he has a great rapport with the young students that he teaches, and they all very much enjoy his classes. Andrew is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow, as well as being a Professor of International Relations and Strategy in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. He's currently researching a subject dear to his heart, Paths to Primacy, How Rising Powers Win Domination in Asia. And he's concentrating on a number of centuries, beginning with 1500 through the present. So he's studying competing dynasties throughout Asia in those 5 centuries. From 2018 to 2020, Andrew served as the ABC Brisbane Radio's resident Trumpologist on Evenings with Kelly Higgins Devine. So he brings a great deal of knowledge, insight and understanding of President Trump, and we all look forward greatly to hearing his insights tonight into what the world, America, Australia can expect from the pending Trump presidency. Andrew Phillips.
Thank you, Colin, for that excessively generous introduction. Check is in the mail. Donald Trump has been inclined to say at different times. I'd like to begin also by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands in which we are based and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like us to cast our minds back to the not so distant past. In the presidential campaign of 2000, candidate George W. Bush, when asked about what America's foreign policy should be, he said, "I would like to see a more humbled United States in the world." Fast forward 20 years, in the triumphant afterglow of his victory over President Trump, Biden proudly proclaimed, "America is back." It would be a return to the multilateralism, the commitment to an open trading order, and the rules-based United States of the past. Fast forward to 2024, and we're in reruns. Donald Trump has returned, and his surrogates have made significant claims about how they will potentially transform the world in the spirit of America First. Prediction makes fools of us all, and I am prepared to be the resident fool tonight. But the reason that I begin by invoking a couple of historical examples is first to try to signal a degree of humility to the extent that soon to be no longer associate professors are capable of when thinking through about the future, but also because I think in order to understand where we are going, it is useful to get a sense of the historical baseline. There are claims that the Trump administration will be transformative of international order, and not that I'm a gambling person, but my suspicion is that in fact it will be transformative. But what I want to do in the presentation tonight is to begin by looking at the historical baseline of the United States grand strategy since 1945. It's been a distinct grand strategy that has committed the United States to a position of global leadership, and a position of global leadership grounded in what has admittedly been imperfectly described as a liberal international order. That grand strategy has been remarkably durable the past 80 years. But over the long span of the American Republic, it's actually an aberration. And it's one that we would reasonably expect would likely pass away at a certain point. The second part of the presentation is going to be a bit of a whodunit. Who killed the liberal international order? And I want to start by making the observation that we cannot sheet blame or credit entirely due to Donald Trump. The liberal international order, I would argue, has been in significant decay for at least the last decade, with the administration's return to power in January 20 next year, I suggest, being the coup de grace. What I want to do then for the remainder is to first trace out not quite the Trump doctrine, because the Donald is not really a doctrine kind of guy, but more kind of the Trump sensibility of how he is likely, I believe, to approach engaging the world in his second term. A term, I believe, that will be very different from the first. And finally, what I want to do is to offer 4 possible worlds that we might be heading into, from the most familiar to the most alarming. I look forward to trying to be as alarming as possible. Okay, first, winding our way back to the 1940s, Harry S. Truman in September 1945 famously turned to his nearest confidants. He said, "Well, boys," it's 1945, so they were all boys. "Well, boys, what do we do with the world?" No country in the history of the state system had enjoyed the margin of dominance that the United States enjoyed in 1945. In 1945, the United States adversaries lay in ruins. Its allies, meanwhile, were exhausted. Britain was broke. France was recovering from the humiliation of the occupation from 1940 to 1945. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people. That's the equivalent of the contemporary Australian population in its fight against fascism. China had also experienced significant bloodshed from really going back to the Mukden incident in 1931, and was about to descend into renewed civil war. So the United States really stood astride the world as a colossus. And what was notable in this period is that there was a remarkable degree of consensus in the US foreign policy cognoscenti. There's a very strong sense that they enjoyed an opportunity to remake the world. A recognition also that there had been a failure of order building in the interwar period, in part due to US reticence to lead, but a determination not to make those mistakes again. I'm just going to flag some of the assumptions that informed US strategic thinkers in the 1940s, and I'm doing so simply as a means of offering an implicit contrast with the mindset of people that may soon get the helm of US foreign policy. So the first most basic assumption of US grand strategy in the 1940s is that United States security and prosperity are interdependent with the rest of the world. There's a great shibboleth that suggests that the United States was divided between realists and isolationists in the 1930s. That is not the case. The key distinction in the 1930s was primarily the original America Firsters, under the leadership of people like Lindbergh and the like, were outliers. The majority of opinion was divided less on a commitment to US internationalism and more on the way in which it would be pursued, with some favouring greater degrees of engagement over others. But there was largely underneath that, there's sort of the truth within the lie about isolationism, there was this belief that the US was insulated by dint of its favourable strategic geography from threats abroad. A disappointment and disillusionment, in particular with the European allies, a belief that the United States could potentially sit things out. And that sense of complacency really only crumbles in the northern summer of 1940 with the fall of France. It's actually not the attacks of Pearl Harbor that wake the United States up, it's the fall of France. But beyond that, there's a belief in the interdependence of the United States' fate for the rest of the world. A concomitant belief. The United States has an opportunity, but also a responsibility to be a system leader, what IR nerds such as myself refer to as a hegemon. The best way that it can achieve its objectives, moreover, is through institutionalized cooperation with like-minded states, that the benefits of multilateralism, the constraints the United States signs up to in embracing a multilateral system, on balance outweigh costs. Likewise, that economic openness is also likely to redound primarily to the United States' benefit. And finally, that the United States' security depends on actively preserving its preeminence in the Western Hemisphere and also ensuring that no dominant power is able to establish control of the world island Eurasia. We look at this period, what is interesting is that the ideas that are fermenting in the 1940s are in equal parts realist in the recognition of the need to pay attention to the balance of power, but also liberal in their aspirations to establish an order built on economic openness, managed though it might be, and a degree of multilateralism. Now, this is the order that has been eulogised by scholars like John Eichenberg, who talk about the idea that the United States is different and distinct from other powers in the way in which it embraced this constitutionalist order. It is reasonable to acknowledge that commitment to this order was imperfect, that there is nothing particularly novel about a US preference on occasion for unilateralism. But broadly as a generalisation, this was a fairly durable set of assumptions. It was one, moreover, that helped form the foundations of US grand strategy during the Cold War and persisted and indeed intensified to a degree in the immediate post-Cold War period. So the key missions that underwrote that set of assumptions. First, the containment of an adversary, primarily the Soviet Union, although interestingly, the intellectual foundation of containment was really germinating from the early 1940s, where there is a sense that it could be either Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union that ends up being that adversary. A belief in a commitment to pacifying world politics through a combination of economic integration and multilateral cooperation. There's a reason that the United States, having abandoned its own creation in the League of Nations in the interwar period, makes the decision to actually have the United Nations headquartered in New York as a physical as well as financial commitment to that particular model of order. A commitment also to pursuing what has been, I would suggest, somewhat humorously described as a policy of nuclear abstinence, not for the United States, but for most of the other powers in the world. A belief that really develops from the early 1960s that a safer world is one in which nuclear weapons are limited in their spread. And finally, particularly in the post-Cold War period, a commitment to the idea of democratic enlargement. The seeds of this, again, you can find going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, but it's also worth noting that Woodrow Wilson was a massive racist. This was someone who actually resegregated the US federal civil service. So he was at the best an imperfect champion of liberalism. But that random historical digression aside, that's kind of the broad lineaments of the order. It rests on three foundations. And the reason that I flag these foundations is to really try to foreshadow a larger set of processes through which the basis of the liberal international order, I would argue, has been crumbling for years, if not decades. Foundations of this, though, and clearly it's important because it requires my prior hydration. Okay. The three predicates, the foundations of the liberal international order. The first an unusual degree of US foreign policy elite consensus. What's really interesting during the Cold War, but actually even going back to the United States internationalist moment in the early 1940s, is the breadth of elite commitment to the United States as having a mission of being extroverted as a leader of the free world. You see, for example, and again, I'm someone I'm fascinated by historical counterfactuals. Let's assume that FDR is unsuccessful in his election campaign in 1944, when de Wilkie, the Republican challenger, is equally committed to the idea of a global US foreign policy posture. And there are arguments throughout the Cold War. There's a consensus, but there's not unanimity. There's always been that anti-globalist fringe on the far right, embodied, for example, by the John Birch Society. They don't really have a degree of intellectual purchase, not only during the Cold War, but for at least a generation afterwards. In fact, I'd suggest that in the post-Cold War era, getting high on their own supply with the commitment to the idea that we'd reached the end of history, there is a sense during this period that the opportunity for consolidating liberalism's contestable dominance is at hand. President Clinton, who, after he left office, complained that he didn't have a great moment of international crisis that would define him as a world statesman. Be careful what you wish for, Bill. But he'd committed to this idea of, okay, well, containment's gone. What could be the next master concept? Democratic enlargement was the commitment. But he had this degree of really quite robust intellectual consensus on both the left and the right. Underpinning that and providing a really significant degree of support for it was the fact that you had a domestic political coalition that was broadly committed to this kind of foreign policy consensus. And here I'm very much, I draw from one of my favourite international relations scholars, a guy called John Ruggie, who talked about the post-World War II era as one of embedded liberalism. So, okay, this is a world order in which the United States commits broadly to ideas of free trade, but it also commits to a system of free trade that is predicated on ideas of macroeconomic policy autonomy, essentially enabling states to pursue policies of full employment, counter-cyclical demand management. A less fancy way of putting this is that there is a truce between labour and capital for a good 30 years. And that system breaks down by the time you get to the late 1970s, only to become partially reinvented and revived through a more monetarist, neoliberal economic model in which there is an implicit bargain that is struck that says, well, the prosperity of a thriving middle class is going to be guaranteed by really the ability to access cheap consumer goods that are coming from the developing world. A bargain, I'd suggest, that was not properly or fully realised. Cheap plasma TVs are great, but they can only get you so far. The final element, which is perhaps the most banal, is that the model worked because the United States had the advantage of being leagues ahead of most powers in the international system in terms of its material capabilities. From the 1940s through the 1970s, the most dynamic economies in the world are essentially operating under US protection and are, for at least 2 decades, spending quite a lot of time just reconstructing themselves. The United States, and this is where I do acknowledge some validity to John Eichenberry's perspective, is the United States is pretty distinct in beating the crap out of Germany and Japan, and then spending quite a lot of money through the Marshall Plan, through various other forms of reconstruction assistance in rebuilding and resuscitating its enemies. What's notable also is that it can afford to do this because these powers have essentially embraced the idea of being trading states rather than being real great powers in the international system. The US also had the great fortune of having as its chief competitor a country that had embraced one of the world's most inefficient systems of economic organisation. If we look at the Soviet Union, this is a country, it says something about conventional state socialism. And we've got the natural experiment. In fact, we've got a few natural experiments If we take East Germany versus West Germany, it's quite an achievement to make Germans inefficient. And yet somehow they're able to do that in East Germany. Prior to 1945, it was North Korea rather than South Korea that was the industrial powerhouse of the Korean Peninsula. And we've seen how well that's going now. The remarkable thing is that you've got client-dependent allies, you've got a sclerotic adversary, and you've got, in the People's Republic of China, following the rapprochement in 1978, a commitment of one of the other key powers in the international system to adopt a policy of, in Deng Xiaoping's phrase, hide and bide. Bide time, build capabilities. The essence of that strategy, which was really clarified in the post-Cold War era, was this was essentially what's been called the convergence wager. The expectation that if a state is being economically integrated into the existing order, if it is being diplomatically integrated, that it will become a responsible stakeholder of that order and will eventually pursue first economic liberalisation and then political liberalisation. Colin's already heard my bit on this, but as someone, I have a nerdish fascination for the rise of great powers in Asian history, and I am fascinated by the fact that this conceit of socialising a potential adversary into conformity and compliance within the international system happens all the time in historic Asia. This was the Ming Dynasty's strategy against the Manchus in the early 17th century. This is a classic barbarian management strategy. It didn't work out so well for the Ming Dynasty, and likewise, the United States has recently been mugged by the reality that China has been quite clever in saying, okay, well, we'll engage in a process of economic development through enmeshment into the international system, but we'll do so in our own terms in the pursuit of self-strengthening without abandoning our ambitions. So, takeaways from that. The constellation that has existed from the 1940s really through to the early 2010s was one in which the United States was extroverted, globally engaged, saw itself as a leader with prerogatives but also responsibilities to the international order, and sought to promote, however imperfectly, however qualified, and however mitigated by its own selfish pursuit of its own geopolitical interests. The United States, after all, is a great power. Great powers are going to great power. This is an order that had broadly liberal characteristics, at least in terms of seeking to promote a particular form of America-friendly democracy and economic liberalisation. It rested on an elite consensus, an enabling domestic set of circumstances and coalitions, and on a favourable balance of power. All three of those things have been in a process of rapid decomposition, I'd say at least from the early 2000s. I won't labour this point, but just to reverse some of the main beats, and also in the interest of transparency, I'm separating these out and dealing with them sequentially as an expository convenience. The reality is these developments are concurrent and mutually reinforcing. Let's start with the disintegration of the elite consensus on the United States' role in the world. There was always a rump element in the Republican Party that was apprehensive about what is now derided as globalism. You go back to the 1990s, and I still have distant recollections of conspiracy theorists talking about the black helicopters over the United States that would soon lead to the subversion of the spirit of the Republic. There's kind of fringe voices, but even at that time, you had equally fringe candidates. Who here recalls Pat Buchanan? Pat Buchanan is this sort of voice on the far right at the time who spices up the Republican primaries with remarkably similar talking points to current President Trump. It was really from the early 2000s onwards in which the ambivalence of the United States about what are we getting out of this leadership arrangement starts to become more pronounced. The first major crack in the edifice, I'd suggest, is the neoconservative moment in the early 2000s. The strategic shock of September 11, 2001 convinces George W. Bush and, most importantly, some of his key advisors, that the best path for the United States in terms of its prosperity and security is to be a little bit more, pardon the pun, liberal in its unilateralism, a bit more committed to the idea of democracy at the point of bayonets. This is the forward strategy of freedom, through which, much like the TV show The Block, they would take a decrepit Ba'athist dictatorship in Iraq and magically, overnight, transform it into a Jeffersonian democracy and a beacon of liberty in the Middle East. It would be a benign democratic domino effect. As Colin would know, if someone had run this crap past me in a seminar, I would not have responded particularly well. It was an ideological vision from the outset. It was one that lacked practicality and was acknowledged as such. The fact the US State Department had produced a 13-volume set of texts about the reconstruction of Iraq and what it would take, and that this was blithely ignored in the early 2000s. Significant first as an early indicator and warning of the breakdown of consensus in US politics elite. But the US has paid a price in blood and treasure for its decades-long detour into the Middle East. The forever wars have been, cost trillions of dollars for the United States, which, even if the view of the US, that's not chump change, unleashed not only massive suffering in the countries in which these occupations occurred. If we look at the fentanyl crisis in the United States at the moment, there's not a non-trivial part of that is return service men and women, often poorly served by the US Veterans Administration, becoming addicted to painkillers as a result of the trauma they experienced overseas. But most notably, and this was really kind of the stark genius of candidate Trump in 2016, it's easy for us to forget now, but it was a big deal, and it was taboo breaking when Donald Trump said in the early stages of the Republican primaries, Iraq war was a terrible idea. Iraq war was a terrible idea, and I'm not someone who'd be in support of those kinds of overseas adventures. I don't know if he said overseas adventures. It was, I don't know if you can fit that in a tweet, but nevertheless. This is someone who is, as much as people might reasonably condemn him for his vulgarity and his violence, he's an entertainer. And an entertainer survives only to the extent that they can read the room. And there was a sense in which he was able to read the room. And he was reflecting on when he was talking about the idea of American carnage. If you look at the way in which the most recent election played out, the Democrats won 80% of the wealthiest counties in the United States. The Republicans won the majority of the low-income counties in the United States. It may end up being a temporary aberration, but so far Trump's victory in 2024 was built on a multiracial working-class coalition. It's not an artifact simply of 2024. You see making significant inroads with the Latino vote in 2020. But what's also notable about this is, again, it comes back to the fragmentation in the political consensus of the majority of ordinary Americans. Is this a good bargain? The United States' contemporary posture in the world. So when Donald Trump, and even more so J.D. Vance, J.D. Vance is Donald Trump with an Ivy League degree. I would say with J.D. Vance, I'm quite open to counting him as a nakedly opportunistic person who described Trump privately as America's Hitler in 2016 and kissed the ring in 2024. My intuition is that Trump is likely to reign, but Vance and co are more likely to rule in the next Trump administration. But he's actually quite specific and particular in noting that his hometown, Ohio, and countless other parts of Middle America have been deindustrialized in commitment to the idea of prosperity through globalization. The final element, we look at this through the lens of the United States relationship to China. That relationship did not improve under the Biden administration. What's notable is that a lot of the more confrontational postures that the United States developed under the Trump administration, the commitment to tariffs as an instrument of economic statecraft, the commitment to accelerating America's commitment to strategic primacy. They may have been articulated most vociferously under Trump. They had their antecedents, though, in the non-existent pivot to Asia proclaimed by Obama as far back as 2011. And they were reflective of a dawning US realisation that the convergence wager, that economic liberalism would lead to political liberalisation and secure United States-dominated liberal international order forever, that grand strategy failed. So all three of the pillars that underwrote the grand strategy of the United States from the 1940s onwards have now crumbled. The reason that seems weird to us, and the reason that many keep waiting, wake up, it'll all have been a dream. My folk intuition on this is that once something has been around for the length of historical memory, about 80 years, it seems like it's forever. But in the case of United States grand strategy, no, 80 years is not forever. From 1783 through to the late 1930s, early 1940s, the United States was as often an introverted as an extroverted power, was as often a power that did not see itself as having a role of exceptional liberal leadership in the world. To the extent that it had a commitment to liberal idealism, was as often a model of exemplarism, of we will be the light on the hill that will lead by example, as it was an evangelical saving the world from itself. So, don't blame Donald Trump for the collapse of the liberal international order is the takeaway. What is international order going to look like? What is the United States grand strategy going to look like in the next few years? So I've really given like 28 minutes on history, and now I'm finally getting to, well, this is what we signed up for today. Well, tough. Okay. Donald Trump. Does he have a clearly codified Trump doctrine? No, he doesn't. And most incoming US presidents do not. If we look at the significant foreign policy thinkers who have occupied the position of the presidency, Richard Nixon, George Bush Sr., smart one, they're the minority. Most of them do not come in with a clear, coherent sense of this is the grand strategy that I'm going to pursue. They are dependent on, for want of a better phrase, the deep state in order to guide them in that direction. Donald Trump, I would wager, has not given a great degree of thought about foreign policy, but nevertheless we can discern both from the first term and from his broad statements in public life, elements of what I would refer to as a Trumpian sensibility that will shape the way that he approaches the world. I suggest that this has 7 elements. Don't worry, I'm going to go through them quickly. This is a foreign policy sensibility that will be egoistic. America first. So far, no surprises. First things that we learn in international relations theory is that states can be best conceived all the time as rational egoists. But the distinction here I'd suggest is that this is a particular form of egocentric foreign policy. That is one that says, okay, America first, and a commitment to the idea of America's interest is best served through that always being the lodestar, rather than acknowledging that there might be an enlightened self-interest in building an order in which the United States doesn't win every interaction, but nevertheless, the system serves it more generally. So, egoistic, dynastic. There is no evidence I've seen in the decade that he has been prominent in US public life that Donald Trump actually understands the idea of public office distinct from private interest. This is something that makes him not that distinct in the overall arc of the history of the state system. L'état c'est moi, Louis XIV's philosophy, but we're likely to see that as returned under Trump. Competitive. If we look at the way in which Trump looks at the world, the particular type of conceptualizing interactions through the lens of zero-sum rather than positive-sum conceptions of win and loss. Trump's a winner, others are losers. And that's an important part of, I think, what will be his larger philosophy. Reflecting the fact that he comes from a commercial background, What is notable in his public policy pronouncements is that he furthermore conceives of interest in very much materialist terms. One of the great advantages I think Australia will have is the fact that we run a consistent and huge trade deficit with the United States. So we're likely to be on Trump's nice list, at least until Kevin Rudd himself. But it's a way of looking at international life that is very much kind of calculates it through the lens of quantifiable material gains and losses. It's one, for example, that looks at alliance relationships and says, you guys are being deadbeats. And that's something actually, by the way, will agree with Donald Trump on. That has been a criticism of pretty much every US president since Kennedy, because it's true. Get your act together, Germany and France and Australia as well. Transactional, but with a preference for unilateralism where possible, bilateralism if he has to, multilateralism only if he cannot possibly avoid it. Personalist, a belief in the primacy of personal relationships and a belief in the power of the president's charisma and savviness to be able to achieve things that professional diplomats cannot. And finally, chaotic. But chaos by design. So Game of Thrones character who talked about the idea of chaos as a ladder. You can see elements of that in Trump. Trump delights in disruption, not simply because it gives him a dopamine hit, but also because he's been very explicit in making a virtue of unpredictability. Of saying, okay, I like to be unpredictable. Back in the day, this was called the Mad Dog Nixon strategy. The problem is that, at least with a mad dog, you know, okay, well, broadly canine, so I can make some assumptions of how this animal is going to operate. Trump would suggest he'll be operating in a whole league of different levels of unpredictability. I'm likely to speak over Colin, but only by about 5 minutes. So it's exercising my own unilateralism here. He's already having influence on me. Okay, so it's a constellation of characteristics that I think we can reliably actually attach to Trump from how we saw the first administration conduct itself, particularly in the latter and less constrained years of that administration, but also on the basis of the signals that we've been getting so far. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief when Marco Rubio was nominated as Secretary of State. The fact that we're breathing a sigh of relief when a neoconservative is being elevated as that kind of gives us an indication of the upside down world that we're now in. But the subsequent announcements of Matthew Gaetz, credibly accused of child sex trafficking as being potentially the chief legal officer, the Attorney General of the United States, a Fox News host as Defence Secretary, who's never run anything larger than a platoon, the Elon Musk, who is the co-head of a Department of Government Efficiency, as if that's not an article out of The Onion. There's already a demonstration of a less constrained president than before. And he's less constrained in part because he's more experienced. There was a sense of frustration that there was the bureaucratic slow rolling in the first Trump administration. The adults in the room did exercise a constraining and limiting influence. This is something that Trump and his advisors are seeking to challenge. So what's it going to look like in terms of grand strategy? Hostility towards multilateralism that is visceral as much as it is intellectual. Again, kind of the language here of globalism is relevant. And one thing that I'd like to emphasize here is we do need to take seriously the ideas behind Trumpism. Trump himself is not an ideologue, but we look at people like Steve Bannon, if we look at the illiberal right, the intellectual dark web, there is a coherent ideology that is illiberal and that seeks to challenge things like multilateralism. A distancing and potential decoupling from entangling alliances. The president cannot abrogate alliances unilaterally, but he will try. And there is, given that the presidency has control over foreign policy, at least some legal wiggle room for him to give it a go. The embrace of protectionism and closed borders, abandonment of democracy promotion in favour of greater flexibility in engagements with other great powers. Not Kissingerian realism, however, more likely to be a form of opportunism. And finally, greater regional variability in US grand strategy. malign neglect of those European losers, a commitment to confrontation, strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in relation to China. I would predict a much more partisan approach to the United States engagement in the Middle East. For those in Dearborn, Michigan, who were voting for Trump rather than Harris because they thought it would be better for the Palestinians, I think are about to get a pretty rude shock. So what does this mean in terms of 4 futures of international order? I'm a big film fan, so I've tried to put these into categories of different films that I like. Number 1, Groundhog Day. Fantastic film. This would be a return to the Trump presidency, Trump 45. Very unlikely. For that to happen, it would need Trump to actually remain within the guardrails of the constraints that he has chafed against and aligned himself against. It would also require America's allies to do something that they have been generally averse to doing. And that is not only to get the wake-up call from Washington, but also not to resort to the habitual reflex of hitting the snooze button. We've been here many times of the United States, even going back to the 1970s, wavering in its commitment to liberal internationalism. And the response of allies is, you've got Macron getting up and saying, we're not herbivores, we're going to be embracing a more robust strategic posture. I believe it when I see it. Peace has innovated the capacity of the Europeans to get their act together, and yet that's probably what would be required for there to be a degree of stability within the system. It would also depend on a favourable balance of power restoring for the United States. Essentially, that would be a world in which China follows the path of Japan in the 1990s, of stagnation and introversion, rather than, say, Japan of the 1930s, of expansion. Okay, so Groundhog Day, I think, is not going to happen. It's a shame, because it's a great film. Second great film, Back to the Future. Back to the Future here would be not a return to 2016, but it would be a return to the historical baseline of a United States that returns to being more introverted, an America that abdicates hegemony and turns its focus inwards. Essentially an America that looks remarkably like America from the 1780s through to the late 1930s. And that could transpire in any one of a number of ways. If Trump actually commits to Project 2025 of dismantling the US federal state, it simply will not have the institutional capacity to play the role of hegemon, even if there is a subsequent turnover in 2028 and a return to a democratic administration. Likewise, if the Trump project fails, there's a strong possibility. Elon Musk has talked about cutting $2 trillion out of the US federal budget, which is about $6 trillion. Well, good luck, because about 13% of that budget goes to debt servicing. You can't do anything about that unless you want to default on US federal debt. And that'll be wild if that happens. Another large part of federal spending goes to things like Obamacare that Republican voters love, provided you don't tell them it's Obamacare. Another area that you might cut, the military, except Trump has promised to increase spending in the military. So there's not going to be an awful lot that you can cut there. But to the extent that you do start to cut into the United States federal government apparatus, you're likely to compromise the quality of services that Americans have come to expect as part of their overall living arrangements. Were that to occur, maybe you might have a democratic populist come to power in 2028, but again, it would be one focused internally. I think that order is also unlikely to evolve simply because the United States is now literally invested in the world in the way that it wasn't in the past. For all the talk about weaponized interdependence, I believe that Apple, through its subsidiaries, is responsible for at least 1% of China's manufacturing industrial employment. That level of economic enmeshment is there, and the United States cannot easily walk away. The last two films, and I'll wrap up at 6:45, are, Clash the Titans. No one recognised that. It was a great old film. But this would be a scenario of full-throated strategic competition between the United States and China. Possibly, if we're going to be even more expansive, there's talk of an ideological confrontation developing between an authoritarian axis of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, versus the democratic world. I think that bigger version is unlikely simply because there isn't that level of ideological coherence in the Trump administration. But what I can anticipate, I'm happy to elaborate on this in Q&A, is the prospect of Trump being quite sanguine about the possibility of collapsing the US nuclear umbrella. We really think that Donald Trump is going to risk Los Angeles in exchange for Seoul, and looking with indifference to the proliferation of nuclear weapons throughout Northeast Asia. Japan, if it wanted nuclear weapons, could get them in 12 months. South Korea could be pretty quick off the bat as well. The final one, and I'll end here, is I couldn't think of an appropriate film, and I thought there's one that's just come out earlier this year called The Apprentice. And this would be the ascendancy of kleptocratic oligarchy as an alternative organising principle within the international system. This would be a world in which America's democratic decay domestically is reflected in a larger process of democratic winter throughout the Western world and beyond. An order in which that brief sliver of a few decades of mass middle class prosperity in the middle part of the 20th century is a historical anomaly. We return to an era not of the fascism of the 20th century, but of a form of kleptocratic oligarchy that is already prevalent in many parts of the world. And on that happy note, happy to take your questions.
Hey. So we've got 15 minutes or 10 or 15 minutes. So does anyone have any questions of Andrew? One there, straight away. Thank you.
Thanks for giving a speech. I just had a question. Economists all over have been trashing Trump's tariff and manufacturing plan because it's generally not in their comparative advantage to manufacture stuff. It's not the 70s, 60s anymore. Is there any world in which you can see that tariff plan actually working, and how would that end up working?
So no, I can't see it working. And I can see it cascading disastrously throughout the world economy because there's historical precedent. I mean, if we look at the breakdown of the free trading order in the 1930s, the US Smoot-Hawley tariff was absolutely catalytic for that process to occur. The concern I have is that it would be very dumb for the Trump administration to do that. But stupidity has never been a barrier to boldness in world politics. I could certainly see an argument in which, I could certainly see a scenario in which the United States commits to it, in which case we are likely to see exactly what we saw in the 1930s, a degree of reciprocal beggar thy neighbour policies occurring. Keep in mind also that the degree of interdependence that we have is that the contagion could actually spread more quickly and more deeply than it did in the 1930s. Illustration of this, okay, so Trump imposes tariffs on Chinese steel. That's a problem for Australia, given that it's an iron ore exporter that feeds into that process of economic development in China. So I think that the risk is real. I think the fact that it would be a very foolish thing to do does not reassure me that it won't happen.
Raj, you were the next one.
Question. Thank you for your speech. If Trump was to, instead of putting the 60% tariff on the Chinese government, if he make sure that the renminbi is traded as a marketable currency rather than a pegged one, would it bring the same outcome? And would Chinese price not go up differently, so achieve the same effect of the 60% that he's trying to do to make them price uncompetitive? That's the right word.
Yeah, so I think I'm certainly not going to claim that I'm a Chinese international political economy expert, but there are sound reasons why China has resisted capital account liberalisation because of the degree of lack of control that it would afford the Chinese Communist Party. The thing that is interesting there is that the possibility of currency appreciation. The United States has been in this situation before. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration and a young Donald Trump were furious about the competitiveness of Japanese exports. In 1985, they had the Plaza Accords where they essentially forced an appreciation of the yen. That, in the longer term, reduced the competitiveness of Japanese manufacturers. And the reason they were able to do it is that Japan was a dependent ally. China is not in the same situation. I think for me, and this speaks to the gentleman's question earlier, the only constraint that is likely to be meaningful, I think, for the Trump administration is something that they've avoided acknowledging, which is that tariffs hurt most in the American hip pocket. The fact that tariffs will have a further inflationary effect, the fact that they will make lives harder for working class and middle class Americans, I think the political consequences of that, and keep in mind, I mean, Americans love their elections. So the next election, the midterms, is coming up in 2022. The risk, if there's a tariff-driven inflationary spike, blue wave in 2026, Trump loses control of the Senate, I think it's that's likely to be constraining.
I'll go with David. You were next, I think. David.
Yeah, Trump has said he can fix the Ukraine conflict just like that. What does it mean for Ukraine and for Putin?
So it's terrible news for Ukraine because, as I said, I mean, Donald looks at things through a dynastic lens as much as anything else. So to the extent that Ukraine is relevant, it's that Zelensky failed to dig dirt on the Biden family for Trump. So there will be an element of vindictiveness that will inform his policy. The idea that he can end the war in 24 hours, there are fast ways of winning a war. The fastest way of winning a war is losing it, of ending a war is losing it. The difficulty for Ukraine is the degree to which America will step down and Europe will not step up. So I'll be really explicit about this. I am furious at the failure of the Biden administration to have backed Ukraine in 2022, 2023, when there was a realistic prospect of inflicting a sufficient defeat on Russia to be able to achieve, I would suggest, a much more stable long-term European political order. Now, not only did the Biden administration in its timidity miss that moment, but Europeans have also failed to step up. So the fear that I have is, we go back to kind of the principles of Trumpism. Materialist, so he's a real estate guy. You know, he'll have this idea of, all right, well, you can have peace through a trade here. He's someone who has also shown unusual deference to Vladimir Putin, question-begging deference to a country whose economy is the size of that of Australia. This is a petrol station with nuclear weapons. Putin doesn't see it. He's obsessed with the idea of reclaiming Russia's great power status. My fear is that he will be unable to do that and Ukraine will be thrown to the wolves under a vindictive and short-termist Trump administration. But I guess that for me, the main point there is that's not simply a failure of the United States. That's a failure of the Europeans as well. It's a failure indeed of Western democracies more generally.
Okay.
We had a couple of online questions. If you
Yes.
can...
Well, the first question, firstly, thank you, Andrew, for those fascinating insights. The first question was about the Ukraine war, so I think you've answered that. But I do have a second question from one of our online attendees, Peter. He's asking, how do you think the UN will be affected by the Trump presidency, especially if the US becomes even more reluctant to pay its dues?
Sure. Well, again, it comes back to Trump's great as a means of getting attention to an issue, as is demonstrated by the AIIA's sagacious decision to have an event on Trump. But as much as Trump would like it differently, it's not all about Trump. If we look at the United Nations, I think that there's a pretty strong argument of being able to say, well, the fact that the United Nations remains so dependent on the United States financial support 8 decades after the end of the Second World War is a reflection as much of the kind of collective action problems and neglect of other powers as it is of the United States fecklessness. So I would say first that the UN is certainly on notice that there is no domestic political downside for Trump going after the United Nations and very little in the way of upside. Keep in mind, this is someone who is very egotistical and was literally laughed at when he spoke before the UN General Assembly. This is someone who won't forget that. So he's no friend of multilateralism. What I will say in a discordant note, if not of optimism, just as an observation, again, great power fecklessness has perpetuated the defensive tendency of the United Nations and the United States. There is always the possibility, though, of one leader steps down, another leader steps up. For me, a really interesting space to observe here is the macro narrative that is kind of common in the West at the moment is you've got the liberal international order. This is an artifice and creation of the West, and it's in jeopardy now because of the rise of other global South powers, particularly China. What's notable, China is now the largest contributor of the P5 to UN peacekeeping operations. China has played a fairly clever and surreptitious game of positioning itself to acquire leadership in a large number of UN multilateral organisations. The reality of world politics is that if you abdicate leadership, the world may not descend into chaos. The world may simply say, you're fired, and transition to another hegemon.
You had a question, I think. I don't know your name.
Yeah, thank you. Great talk today. Question is regarding America's currency as a reserve currency. One, what does it mean, Trump administration, what it means for that one. And the second thing is around BRICS, as a rival multilateral institution that's growing and expanding right now versus the one that's been set up before.
Yep. Okay, so great questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the BRICS one because I think that it's sort of the larger structural one. The interesting thing with the US, the dollar status as a reserve currency is that its end has long been prophesied, and yet whenever there are crises, people tend to retreat to the safe harbour of US dollar-denominated assets. I think with regards to BRICS, the first thing I'd note is there's a certain irony that an acronym that some quirky Goldman Sachs boffin came up with in 2007 has actually become elevated as potentially the voice of the global South. There's a certain irony there. I'd say I am sceptical about the BRICS, but sanguine about the growth of different leadership complexes within the international system. So the reason I'm cynical about the BRICS is first, I'd say, okay, well, what's holding the acronym together? And at least with NATO, I can say, well, North Atlantic, and there's a treaty. There's even an organisation. They have a secretariat with a gift shop, so I can thoroughly recommend. BRICS, on the other hand, there is weakness in multiplication. At the moment, people can be simply championing BRICS as saying, okay, well, there are new members that are constantly joining. But that could dilute its focus as much as it could consolidate it. I think the larger message, though, and there's a terrific book, by the way, called Exit from Hegemony, written by Daniel Mexon and Alexander Cooley, where they talk about, well, how might the US hegemonic order end? Keep in mind they're writing a few years ago. But one of the arguments that they made is, well, you have a process of hegemonic good substitution. That, if there is a gap in the provision of infrastructure finance, your country steps up to address that. If the United States abdicates leadership in the energy transition, as political economy-wise it looks like it might be doing, well, then another power might step up. So I think for me, the potentially a source of optimism, or at least resilience in world order, might in fact be the degree to which we might have a more fragmented, more polycentric, but potentially more resilient set of governments, institutions that develop as a result.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll call on Graham now to move the vote of thanks. I'm sorry we haven't got any more time for any more questions, and Graham will also be telling us about